joining us from today. I want to welcome you to the fourth in a series of 4 NCME webinars focusing on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in assessment. Our focus today will be on educational assessments in the K-12 sector. And I'm here with my co-host, Marianne Perie. I'm Ellen Forte with EdCount LLC, and I will be facilitating the first part of our session today. We're going to start off by introducing you to the panelists, and I'll turn to that first slide there first. We do want to encourage you, if you wish to participate in this more actively and have some comments or chats, to please make use of that chat function. We will be looking at that and pulling questions from there, comments and questions from there a little bit later on today. Mostly the presenters will not be monitoring the chat during their presentations, but please know we are taking a look at that for the question and answer section of the session today. So our panelists, we've got Kristen Huff.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Thank you.
And I'll leave up her bio for just a second if you want to have a read of that. Fiona Hinds.
Good day, everyone. It's great to be here to discuss this important topic. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Deb Kame.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm happy to join the conversation today.
Stephanie Snyder.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here to discuss this with you today.
Our format for today will start off with a presentation of about 10 to 12 minutes from each of our presenters, the panelists you just met, and then we're going to engage in a conversation around some questions. I've listed those here. You're going to see that some of the presenters may address parts of these questions, but their presentations are not necessarily designed to address any one or any set of these. So they will be bringing in some ideas of their own from their own perspectives during these presentations. And then we'll come back to these questions after the presentations and hold a discussion. As I mentioned earlier, we will be looking at the chat and pulling some comments and questions from there. So we do encourage you to actively engage in this discussion today and put your notes, comments, ideas in that chat. I think we're ready to get going. We're going to turn over to Kristen Huff.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to share the work we're doing at Curriculum Associates. I'm here representing the work of many individuals, and I am so honored to do so. Next slide. Thank you. These results are a few years old, 2015, but are largely representative of what we've seen year after year for decades. Regardless of the scale, state, national, international. Note how the US in orange ranks about halfway down on PISA, maybe not quite halfway, but that's not my point. My point is when you disaggregate US performance by race, ethnicity categories, you see terrible disparities across US students. This is a problem. And as someone who's been in this field of educational measurement for over 25 years, until a few years ago, I would have said with some degree of confidence that assessments are only the messenger, not the problem. However, for the past few years, I have been challenging my own long-held beliefs and assumptions that are at the heart of our field's discipline, such as the notion that we have largely mitigated bias from our assessments and that what we see with disparities like these are the result of adverse impact due to opportunity to learn, poverty, or a host of any other inequalities over which supposedly assessments are powerless. I start here as a backdrop of our equity work at Curriculum Associates. Next slide. First and foremost, Curriculum Associates is a curriculum and instruction company. It's right there in our name. And we know that teacher expectations matter. On screen is a quote from TNTP's seminal research in the opportunity myth. If you're not familiar with this research, I urge you to go read it. But that's not the only source. There's a host of studies from Hattie and others that support this claim as well. Expectations matter. Next slide. And teachers need tools that match their expectations, that help them put their high expectations for all students into practice. As such, these are the 4 equity principles that we use at CA to guide our curriculum development, instructional tools and strategies, and professional development, and most recently, assessment. With more time, I could walk through examples for each of these 4 categories, but today I will focus on the goal that our assessment content reflects the authentic lives of our students. Next slide. A couple of years ago, we formed an intentionally interdisciplinary advisory panel to help us think through what it could mean to start designing assessment items that are more authentically represent the students we serve. You may recognize the names of folks at the top of the slide. These are folks who come to NCME and who we've come to be very familiar with their scholarship. You may not recognize the names of the folks in the second half of the slide. These are folks from pedagogy and instruction and a real interdisciplinary mix. That's where the magic happens. I've also want to give a note of gratitude to partners in this research, WestEd and the Center for Measurement Justice, the founding president of whom is Dr. Jennifer Randall. And we're really excited to work with these organizations. Next slide. Our process has been iterative, from idea to definition, design, development, prototype, verification, production, and delivery. It's iterative, it overlaps, it's not necessarily linear, but it does follow this general trajectory. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that part of our process has been unlearning. Most of that unlearning comes into play around context in assessment items. We as assessment designers are taught to ruthlessly strip items of anything that could potentially contribute to construct irrelevant variance or bias. However, as we try to create more inclusive assessment content, we are bumping up against current notions of what constitutes objective or neutral content. In other presentations I've given here and elsewhere, we have made the case that what we have long held up as neutral or objective content is actually laden with assumptions from a single cultural perspective. This is what must be unlearned. So generally speaking, we are at this point in the process where we are developing prototypes, taking them for review, adjusting when necessary, field testing some at a large scale, and taking other types of items through a more qualitative investigation. Next slide. Back in January, in this series on NCME, from NCME equity webinars, you may have attended the one in January and learned of the great work by Darius Taylor and Molly Faulkner-Bond from WestEd in our collaboration to get student voice represented very early in the design and development process. I won't repeat the results of that research here. The video is actually online, and I encourage you to watch it. Next slide. Based on what we learned from those early phases of prototyping and student input, we have developed a multi-year research agenda. The goals and intentions of this research agenda are iterative and build upon each other, and I see it more as a spiral than a circle. That is, if our ultimate goal is to design tests that are fair for all students, we must diversify the culture represented in the assessments. We believe this will result in more accurate scores and reduction of score gaps over time. And as we learn more, we can continue to design better and better assessments for all students whom we serve. Next slide, please. So this is a taxonomy for item design that we are working with. It is the circles are intended to overlap, and we are not sure quite how to define this trajectory, but that's part of what we are working on. And we know it needs to be researched based. But generally speaking, we claim that our industry is pretty much towards the left of this trajectory, where items are designed from this perspective of thinking that the items are all objective and neutral, and but really it is from a very single monocultural perspective. As we move towards the right of this trajectory, we first start to develop diverse, authentic representation of the students that we serve in our in the US population. Next, we start to move towards something that we have called culturally and linguistically responsive. And then from there into something that is culturally and linguistically sustaining. And then at the end of this trajectory, items that actually promote notions of social justice and disrupt current thinking around historical and systemic racism. Now, if you ask me to define each of these, I can start to define that, but we don't yet as a field, or even within our own small group of researchers, have crisp and clear definitions of how these different types of items differ and how they are similar and what they look like. Our true north, the vision we have, is after we do some development and prototyping, we can refine our definitions and eventually get to the place where we have design parameters for items that fit within each of these categories. We're at the beginning of that journey. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share a bit with you on our research agenda. It is organized as follows. First, we have several claims that we are investigating. Those claims are organized into these categories that you see on the screen. Example claims include, for example, historically marginalized students feel valued and affirmed through their assessment experience. Or inclusive item design does not result in a decrease in the proportion of students able to provide evidence of their proficiency. We have a lot of these claims organized into these groups. Next slide, please. To fit in the same structure as our broader validity argument for our assessments, we wanted to further categorize these claims by the sources of validity evidence from the standards. It was somewhat useful, but given where we are in the design and development process, most all of the claims we are dealing with at this time fall into the first two categories of validity evidence from test content and validity evidence from response processes. Next slide, please. We then further categorize the sources of data that are available to us. We are doing limited large-scale field testing, but when we obtain those data, we will be able to do quite a few interesting analyses that I hope to share with you in upcoming venues. At this time, though, we have determined that more qualitative data sources are much more informative. So for this year and the foreseeable future, 12 to 18 months, yes, we're going to still do some field testing, but we are putting a lot of energy into cog labs, interviews, focus groups, surveys, and observations. And then the the last layer of this is that the cells of this table are populated with very specific research questions. That's what the purple question marks represent. So examples of the specific research questions driving our agenda are, for example, to what extent do students see their own personal lives reflected in the assessment experience? Or how do non-marginalized students describe their mental and emotional state after the test experience? Neutral, positive, other? Next slide. Here are a few item examples. If you recall our taxonomy, these are our first initial attempts to vary cultural representation in items in authentic ways. These items are in various stages of prototyping and field testing. And for each item, we have either or both the writer or a reviewer from the culture represented. This is critical content validity for our claims of authenticity. It's the cultural orientation of the writer, of the reviewers, and the research that goes behind each item. This research, this additional review, it adds time and steps to the item design and development process. Next slide. There are lots of other validity questions too. We can't do this all ourselves, and we are working hard to support the research endeavors of others in this area. One that I'm particularly excited about that stems from some great dialogue between Michael Rodriguez and Jennifer Randall, both of whom are on our panel, is whether this entire arena is about just sampling better from our universe of content that's out there, or whether this is really about changing the construct that is the heart of what we're trying to measure. I don't know the answer, but I think these are the right kinds of questions we should be asking. And finally, next slide, in closing, I'd like to end with bringing us back into the classroom. Authentic content and assessment is but a means to an end. Our end goal is actually supporting educators in their endeavor to bring to life equitable instructional practices, because that's what really matters for our students. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Our next panelist presenter is Fiona Hinds.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here to represent Cognia and to share with you the work that we are doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion in K-12 assessment. Next slide. Our Cognia is committed to improving learning for all students, and this is our core work that we do at our organization. And we also understand and believe that students should have the opportunity to see themselves in materials that they are engaged in while learning and during their assessments. We also understand that learning is both cultural and a contextual experience, and that when students are valued and empowered within the learning process, they have an opportunity to have access to demonstrate what they know. We're currently exploring and defining our research agenda, where we are framing the phenomenon of cultural relevance and learning experiences. And this process is an internal framework so that we can be informed and change and adjust the practices that we have in order to support learning, in order to support the experiences with assessment. Next slide. These are the guiding principles that are framing our internal work as we are looking at the context for supporting a research agenda and also to support the work that is needed in order to understand how underrepresented students need context in order to support them with tools and assessments that are both empowering and that build value. We're listening to the experiences of students, educators, and the communities for ways in which that we can support and provide visibility to the experiences of students who have been traditionally marginalized, so that we can increase encouraging, engaging, and achieving students based on the kinds of tools and supports through our assessment framework. Using this lens is an ongoing process that continues to support the transformation of our practice. These guiding principles have led to ongoing enhancements and changes in our assessment program here at Cognia. When we address cultural relevance, this is significant to dismantling inequities. And similar to what Kristen also just described, we also understand that we have to move beyond a color neutral or culture neutral dynamic. And Dr. Jennifer Randall has noted specifically that we have to stop trying to remove the cultural context from our assessments and look towards providing meaningful connections for students, and that this provides students with opportunities to connect and to demonstrate what they know. We're also working and understand that the context for these guiding principles on our internal practices and the value of transforming these practices is certainly also a conversation and a connection with how we partner with states, districts, and schools, because we understand that the context for each state, for each district, and for each school is different. The lived experiences, the supports that are needed, the cultural context, and the goals of a state department, a district, and or a school are important while we continue with building this conversation and building the foundation of creating practices and frameworks that center students, student culture, and context. Specifically, and Kristen also described the importance of the content in the stimulus and item development practices and the connection that this can provide. We understand that we internally need to address these guiding principles as we use this lens to revisit the practices that we are currently engaged in. Next slide. As we are considering what it means for stakeholders to be a part of this process, we're also considering their voice, and that this guiding principle for stakeholder voice is an opportunity to frame data collection that brings us closer to understanding student culture and student experiences, as well as the community. Identifying and listening and defining these elements provides us with the direction that we need to inform how we make decisions around contextual connections that represent students in authentic ways. Engaging with the communities for the purpose of meeting them not only where they are, but supporting our educational communities with meeting their goals is where we believe that bringing in stakeholder voice can not only connect us, but that we can leverage the power of their voice to improve the understanding of assessment, the understanding of learning processes in order to connect students to our work and to their learning. This also includes taking a second look and revisiting the bias and sensitivity processes that end with an emphasis on accommodations and cultural relevance and representation versus the elimination of culture, which is mostly provides a default to our dominant white culture context, which eliminates the opportunities and possibilities for representation and inclusion of student experiences. I'd like to share an example of connecting cultural relevance, stakeholder voice, and meeting the goals of the educational community with the work that we've been doing with Boston Public Schools. They have been working on specifically towards the goal of creating an anti-racist assessment system and increasing equity at the curriculum, instruction, and assessment levels. Next slide. One of the things that we have had an opportunity to do with supporting Boston Public Schools with the goal of anti-racist curriculum assessment and instruction is that we have partnered both Cognia, Boston Public Schools, and Susan Lyons alongside of district leaders and teachers. We've been working together to define cultural relevance and to support their goal of developing and creating an anti-racist system. One of the things that we have been exploring, and I think this is certainly something that during this webinar that we are trying to understand, is how do we define what cultural relevance is? How do we define systems that specifically support dismantling the inequities that are currently in existence? And so one of the things that we did was we had discussions about the continuum. What does it take to move towards their goal of an anti-racist system? And one of the things that we understand is that, and that we're beginning to uncover, is that there are steps to get to this particular framework. And it includes those definitions that Carla Evans has framed around culturally sensitive processes and practices, cultural relevance, cultural responsiveness, and cultural sustainability. And that these are all a part of building a system that is framed and supports an anti-racist assessment system. And one of the things that Evans also explores is the question of whether or not there are opportunities or limitations and challenges in making large-scale testing more culturally responsive. And I mention that because during our work and partnering, and we're in the midst of this, partnering with BPS and the alignment of working towards this system and being able to identify the work and the collaboration with our stakeholders currently, that we have not only been defining what this means along the way, but we've also been challenged by very specific framing of what it means to have a context for social justice for students. And this has provided us with opportunities not only for dialogue, but to also be pushed to look at what we can do in order to intentionally design a system that disrupts racist structures. And Susan Lyons defines this as a system that is intentionally designed to disrupt racism and racist structures, and that anti-racism in assessment attends to both content and design of the assessments and the interpretation and use of assessments to create a more just future for all. And I think that this has been an incredible framing and experience with this collaborative project. And I'd like to share sort of where we are with this and where we have identified moving from the identification of a social issue to creating supports and framing for connecting students. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things that we did was we took the issue of climate change as an issue, and we moved from the working with teachers, identifying the theme, being clear about what the intent was, which was to provide an opportunity to identify a social justice issue and to highlight students of color. It was interesting because we began with Greta Thunberg. And as we discussed her role and the incredible work and leadership that she has provided, we were also noted that what about students of color who are not being heard, who are activists and who are speaking up about climate change? And the teachers actually were the ones who pushed us to identify, and there it is, to identify specific informational texts that would support highlighting students of color who are activists around climate change, because we do hear about Greta and we don't hear about these students. And so we went from the original paired passages, which included how global warming is destroying reefs and coral reefs polluting the rainforest of the sea. And we moved to two new passages, which are Meet a Young Activist of Color and Climate Change is Racial Justice. And we were able to take the paired passages that were originally used and select two different paired passages, which would meet the goal for the district to provide opportunities for greater representation and for students of color to be visible and for for there to be authentic connections for all students. And so these examples are under editorial review, but I wanted to share these with you as an opportunity for us to understand how the guiding principle of including stakeholders, teachers, having the dialogue, focusing on cultural relevance as it relates to students' experiences, and beginning to figure out how to do this. I think where we are in this, and in terms of design and development, as Kristen identified, and understanding that this is a need, and figuring out how we're going to do it, and testing these models that perhaps have not been tried before. And so we are within that process right now. There's another example on the next slide in terms of the other passage that we used for the climate change is racial injustice as well, and the question task, as well as the new question and the original question that we used to identify this work. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next guiding principle that we have identified to reflect and to use for our guiding principle in addressing DEI is the unintended consequences and the consideration for underrepresented students, and the understanding of the impact, the negative impact of processes and outcomes. Our research, our agenda is certainly an opportunity for us to not only identify the areas where we need to evaluate, enhance our measurement practices and design development, but also an opportunity to try things out, to create case studies and to frame the questions in a way that will support us in going out and doing the work and collecting the data that supports our transformation in processes and practices in order for the outcomes to be more equitable. We currently use the Principled Assessment, Development, Design, and Implementation framework, and we are taking all of the steps within that framework and applying our guiding principles to that in order to complete the research agenda. Next slide, please. And finally, our work in addressing these guiding principles is specifically to support and inform our practice, and to review our protocols, to question what we do and how we do it, and at the same time supporting flexibility in the context of how we support our states, departments, our districts, and our schools. And maintain at the same time our purpose to provide pathways for students and to remove barriers to support learning for all students. Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Deb Kane, Assistant Principal for the state of Washington.
Good afternoon. I'm Assistant Superintendent of Assessment and Student Information in Washington State. Next slide, please. First, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial and who still inhabit the area today, the State Chess Band of Indigenous people of the Squaxin Island tribe. Next, please. So I felt it particularly important to include our agency's equity statement for our discussion today. It is at the center of what we do. And I'm going to just pull out a couple of bits from it about examining the way that policies and practices result in disparate outcomes, engaging students, and dismantling systemic barriers. Wanted to kind of get that at the beginning. It's something we're constantly thinking about. Next slide. So as my role at the state education agency sort of ranges from assessment to accountability. And when I was reflecting on this panel, this presentation on DEI, it took me to thinking about what happens when with assessments, and also about the purposes, the uses, the outcomes, and trying to disentangle that and thinking about what do we do and how do we approach it. So thinking about the uses, and I've just very roughly categorized some here. It's certainly not all of them, but what is now, that there's accountability, and that, yes, that word is listed there twice. One is with the capital A, and how we describe it: capital A accountability, federal accountability, identifying schools for support. And then another accountability, the little a accountability, which we kind of think about as visibility, engagement with the community, other types of things that are not necessarily sort of the federally required. And another use is information for individual students and families. And also, I categorized it as actions related to individual students, but some things along assessment might be part of a graduation requirement, or it could be to determine program eligibility, such as the ELP assessments, or it might be for course placement. So there are different uses. So if we thinking about the outcomes and ultimately graduation, but overarching all of this is equity. That's an umbrella over all of it, spanning it. So next slide, please. So I wanted to think about the purpose for the assessment influences how you approach equity, and where are our leverage points at the state education agency, and how can we influence it. So where can changes happen and when? So in some ways in upfront, or in kind of the middle, or in later mitigating impacts. If you could scroll a couple times to show my fancy arrows in my not very sophisticated graphic design work. Oh, back one, there we go. So things up front, and thinking about that, the arrow that's on the far left, about how can we drive or affect equity? And it could be changes in the assessment requirements from the Department of Education. So it could be something like flexibility, introducing student choice in the assessment, allowing students to select reading passages or writing topics that are more likely to engage them. It could be also in development, representing further diversity of authors or cultures in reading passages. And then there's also in the middle arrow there, sort of about after you have an assessment, how do you make sure it's more accessible for students? So you might think about it as sort of retrofitting. There's been a lot of emphasis here in the past from the state perspective around accessibility or translation or adaptations after the test already is. And then on the right side, there's more about maybe mitigating impacts. You already have this, and then what? And so part of that can be around adding context or additional measures, that the test isn't the only thing, but you might think about other measures about a school, if you're talking about that purpose and looking at school outcomes or school performance, including a larger context, rounding out the picture, and emphasizing progress is another way to do it rather than overall achievement. And we think about that with respect to our state accountability system. And then another way is to have alternatives available. So if it is a graduation requirement, is that it's just one of many graduation requirements. In Washington, we have a pathways requirement, but it's one way to achieve that. There are other ways to earn that graduation, to meet that graduation requirement. And then another way to mitigate the impact is to bolster in-classroom understanding and learning of students, and using culturally responsive formative assessment. This is just a very simplified view of the spectrum, but I was trying to kind of convey the range of considerations from the state level, and as we think about the work that we're doing with respect to equity. So if you could move to the next slide. So thinking about the range, there's sort of some changes at the onset, the development before the test actually exists, the adjustments or accommodations kind of in the middle, or mitigating the impact. But the question that spans all of this, and it spans all of the work that we do, is just kind of asking, how does it affect equity with respect to everything we do, and thinking about it and rethinking what we have done historically. So some examples of what Washington is doing, thinking about some of these. One is around assistive technologies, and we've developed a longstanding collaborative partnership with the Special Education Technology Center around changing technologies and assistive technologies for students. So helping us understand what's new, what might still be a problem, and kind of what's coming. Another area that Washington has been working on is to provide access for students who are blind to the ELP assessment, allowing them the opportunity to demonstrate their language skills in all 4 language domains. And then another area is around culturally responsive formative assessment. So we're providing support for educators to learn about culturally responsive formative assessment to help capture and teachers build on what students' cultural knowledge and what's more appropriate for understanding individual students and their learning. And we hope that by providing support for teachers to understand their students' learning in culturally responsive ways, that it'll provide educators with models of assessment that can better reflect students' strengths and cultural knowledge. And then throughout all of this, other work that we've been doing, of course, is around the who's involvement, the diversity, and getting more diverse representative and more voices involved in the process. This might be on advisory committees, planning committees, development, as well as dissemination of student score reports, understanding what families understand and the information that they want from the assessments. So I will pause there and move to our next presenter, who is Stephanie from the other Washington.
Thanks, Deb. Hi, I'm Stephanie Snyder. I am the Interim Director of Assessments at the District of Columbia Office of the State Superintendent of Education. Try saying that 3 times fast. Very happy to be here to talk with you this afternoon. I'm going to share a little bit about our journey in the space of culturally responsive and anti-racist assessment, and acknowledge that we have a long way to go, and just want to talk about where we are and how we're hoping to move forward. You can go to the next slide. Just to set some context and give you an idea of the student population of DC, and these figures are a couple years old at this point, but when we announce our goal to develop culturally responsive and anti-racist assessments, who are we talking about? It's our students, it's our community, our family, their families. DC, the District of Columbia, serves about 95,000 public school students in K-12. That's a combination of traditional public schools, public charter schools, students in non-public placements, and a very small number of non-resident students who pay tuition to attend DC schools. Just over half of DC public school students attend the traditional District of Columbia public schools, and just under half attend public charter schools. So we have a pretty wide landscape of students who we serve. And if you note the graphic on the right, the majority of our students are African-American or Hispanic. Roughly 84 to 85% of students we serve belong to those ethnic categories. Next slide. So what I want to emphasize throughout this presentation is the Office of Assessment's posture of continuous improvement. You'll see this in the remaining slides, that we have a lot more questions than answers at this point, but where we are in our journey is to learn. And I really appreciate the other panelists who spoke this afternoon. I've already taken many, many notes and have lots of follow-up questions of my own. But at this point, we're in DC wanting to learn what's happening in the field, what points of entry are there to make progress and to keep learning and aiming to know better so that we can do better and be better servants to our population, our students, and our communities. And with that in mind, we do need to start somewhere. So we have our Office of Assessments has a mission statement to work in partnership with our key stakeholders. That includes students, families, educators, administrators, the community, to make sure that the statewide assessments that we administer are accurately measuring student performance, producing actionable data, and providing tools and guidance to improve educational outcomes for all learners. Specifically in the space of culturally responsive, culturally relevant assessments, we are seeking to develop a framework and create that process of continuous improvement to develop culturally responsive, anti-racist, summative statewide assessments in DC. Next slide. So our priorities are many, but we have started by identifying 3 main priorities for our statewide assessments. There are many more things that we'd love to do, but we need to start somewhere, and this is where we are directing our focus at the moment. And just to frame, these priorities are very much aspirational. They're things we'd like to see, but we acknowledge that we're not there yet, and we are doing what we can to take steps to move forward. But starting at the top, the first priority is that all students have an equitable opportunity to demonstrate what they know and can do. That's not a new idea in large scale assessment, but it is foundational and it's always a guiding principle in our work. This idea is built into the foundation of how our assessments are developed. That said, we know there is room for vast improvement to make sure that all students are able to access our assessments, and we acknowledge that and keep it at the forefront as we think through what things we can do to build on what we have currently. Our second priority goes back to a couple slides, the students of DC. We have acknowledged in a statement that we want all of our students to feel a sense of inclusion and an ability to see themselves and their communities reflected in our statewide assessments. That said, inclusion is a purposeful activity. It's more than just including authors or characters from underrepresented communities. It's really about students being able to see their varied lived experiences validated as worthy of study and worthy of inclusion in this aspect of their education. So not only do we want to see themselves and their communities reflected, but also want to avoid telling a single story about any one community or group of individuals. Our third priority encompasses a lot and seeks to identify some points of entry for small changes or shifts in thinking to bring about the larger changes that we may want to see. So the activities listed under this third bullet are fundamental parts of the large-scale assessment development process. And we seek to interrogate how they, in their current form, may be working in conflict with some of our stated goals and priorities, and thinking about ways that we can change those building blocks and help them to contribute to the outcomes that we want to see. So in thinking about, I think other panelists have mentioned, thinking about what we mean when we say bias and sensitivity review processes. What are we looking for? How are we seeking to shape the content through those reviews? And maybe the ultimate goal is not to completely remove context, but to expand what we define as acceptable context on a standardized assessment. So there are many entry points in the development process that we can pinpoint for interrogation and change. Next slide. Of course, we have to acknowledge challenges, and there are broad challenges across the field that many have been spoken to by previous panelists, but this slide is meant to get a little bit deeper into challenges that we are seeing as our team in the DC Office of Assessment. We have a vision, we've identified our priorities, but now what? How do we keep moving ahead? There are a lot of things that, as I mentioned, we're kind of at the beginning, we're on a journey. We are working to realize the priorities that we have identified, but had to take a few steps back. We said the things, we made the statements, but what does it really mean to be able to act on those and improve? What concrete actions can we take to move forward? What barriers are we facing? what do we need to work through those challenges? And the challenges listed on this slide touch on all aspects of the assessment development process. And some are easier to address than others, but all of them require careful thought and collaboration with our stakeholders, our students' communities, and also collaboration and thought with our vendors who are developing the assessments. And as I said, we don't have the answers, but just wanted to acknowledge these are some of the things that we're thinking about. And I will move on to the next slide. Don't want to be completely gloom and doom. So there are some bright spots in this work. It's not all challenge and adversity. We do have the advantage of positive momentum and engagement on this topic, as evidenced by this panel today and the series, and just overall engagement that we've seen in our field across a number of years. And there's engagement with other states, organizations, vendors, technical advisors. There's a lot of coalescing around just even talking about what assessment is and how we can make it better for the students who we're serving. I'm a big believer in collaboration. It's the classroom teacher in me. I think the more minds we have discussing and innovating and pushing each other's thinking, challenging each other to do better, the faster we can get to some great ideas and research and doing better for our students. My final slide is what's next for OSSE and for our team and our department. As we mentioned in our priority, we're seeking to develop a framework and create a continuous improvement process for culturally responsive and anti-racist summative assessments. What do we need to get there? More exploration, more interrogation of our own definitions of those terms and how the principles apply to the development administration of statewide assessments. More talking to educators, talking to community members and students to understand their perspectives, what they want to see, and how those perspectives can inform our next steps in conversations with our vendors and how we can act on what it is our stakeholders want to see. In the long run, longer term, we also just want to understand the impact of all the changes that we're hoping to implement. We've said we want to do all of these things. We want our assessments to serve our students, underrepresented students better. How can we tell that the changes that we make are actually doing that? So thinking about how we measure the impact of changes that we make. How do we understand whether students really do have a truly more engaging experience with their assessments and a greater ability to demonstrate and really reflect what they know and can do on the assessments. So lots of questions, some answers and taking some steps, but still acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do, and I'm very eager to hear questions and engage with the panels. Turn it back to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to all of our presenters. That was a lot of food for thought. And Ellen, if you'll just take us to the list of questions.
Sure.
What we want to do now is open it up more to a panel. And I'm going to start, where was it? With this idea of, it's really number 2, about increasing validity of individual results while maintaining comparability across students. And I'm starting there because we got a question in the chat that was specifically about using tests to identify gifted and talented students or special ed students, and saying as they're striving to be more diverse and inclusive, that they're allowing more responses, different kinds of responses from students from different cultures, but then they're running into an issue with struggling to maintain standardization. So let me start with you, Kristen. Are you able to, have you thought about how do we increase validity of individual results while maintaining comparability and standardization?
Yeah, I can speak to a couple of things that may get at the question. I don't have like a silver bullet answer, but in some of the work that we've been doing at CA around oral reading fluency, which I think is the closest thing we may have to what the question is, because it is a direct one-on-one assessment. we have provided guidance in, for the L of CLR, right, linguistically responsive. We have provided guidance to our educators who are administering these assessments to make sure that when students respond with African American vernacular English or accented English, that they are not, that is not counted against them with regard to reading fluency. So I do think there are ways to make sure that we're being responsive in these types of assessments while being true to diversity and inclusion, and still maintaining some sense of standardization. In terms of the most of the assessments I deal with are very large scale. They're not one-on-one assessments. And I do think that this question changes depending on whether you're talking about a one-on-one direct assessment or something that's more large scale. And I think this idea of increasing validity of individual results while maintaining comparability across students, when I saw this question, it made me remember, several discussions I've heard in these venues about, well, if we want the assessment or to be very much culturally and linguistically responsive, sustaining, then we need to tailor the assessment to the student's particular cultural orientation. And I think that can maybe happen at the state level or district level, but I don't think it's something I would promote at the student level, because part of what we want to do is not only provide mirrors so students see themselves, but also windows into the cultures of their fellow students. And so I think that comparability within a system can be maintained, but Texas and Boston Public Schools may have very different learning objectives that one can meet. The fact that Boston Public Schools and DC are committed to anti-racism, that means that the systems of assessments there may look very different than the systems of assessments in Texas or other places. And so I think within that system, you can maintain comparability. So those are my thoughts to that question. Not a perfect answer, but those are my thoughts to the question.
Those are intriguing thoughts. Let me hear from a state representative. Deb, have you thought about this at all and some of the work you're doing in Washington?
Yeah, one of the things that when this came up that I was thinking of is we have it's called WAKIDS, or the Washington Kindergarten Inventory of Developing Skills. And it is sort of a transition process as a student, enters into the K-12 system. And there are 6 domains within that assessment. There's certainly other parts of WAKIDS and learning about students as they enter, but this is an assessment, and there's a training process that the kindergarten teachers need to go through in order to do this. And I don't know how many hours it is, but there's a fairly developed training process to get some inter-rater reliability for this. It serves a different purpose than some of the assessments we're discussing here, but it's along the same idea.
Thank you. Let's try a different question. Let's go back to that first one. And Fiona, have you thought about the differences among diversity, equity, and inclusion and how you address all 3, or is DEI just becoming a single term?
I think that we have certainly looked at each one of these, and I also think they often get clumped together. One of the areas that we have been focusing on in terms of diversity is the aspect of representation and the opportunity for there to be reflections of students, so that there isn't sort of this monolith of experience or reflection in literature or in our practices as it relates specifically to having students have the opportunity to see themselves. And So yes, we have talked about these and addressed these in different areas. And when it comes to equity, we've had a lot of discussion around what accessibility means in the context of equity, because when we think about accessibility and we think about equity, we often revert specifically to the tradition of supporting students with various abilities and the opportunities for access and accommodations. And one area that has come up as it relates to equity and expanding that definition is equitable access in terms of when there is an opportunity for students to have cultural context and connections, that making a connection and having contextual as well as cultural relatability is a part of equitable access. And so expanding what equity means and what it means in terms of how it's reflected in our practices and what we provide for students has certainly been changing our conversation as it relates to cultural relevance, as well as bias and sensitivity being an equity issue, an issue where we are focusing specifically on removing context, yet there is significance and importance in understanding that context and culture is important and that it needs to be a part of how we consider what equity is and what equitable access is. And when we have identified and addressed the aspect of inclusion, we've considered what it means to understand deeper culture, so that it's not the surface aspect of the opportunity to, yes, see ourselves, but what does it mean to be reflected on a deeper level and understanding the connections of culture on a deeper level, not just at that superficial sort of foods and activities or celebrations, but the experiences, the specific experiences that are acknowledged and included in our work.
Thank you. And again, what about from more of a policy perspective? And Stephanie, are you thinking about these three terms separately and approaching them differently in Washington, D.C.?
Absolutely. I think I actually prefer the order of diversity, inclusion, equity, but that acronym is not as compelling. But I think in terms of disentangling these three ideas, it does take a lot of study and self-questioning about what do we really mean when we say diversity, inclusion, equity. I think you can't have inclusion and equity without diversity. So there is a starting point there in making sure that from a assessment content perspective, that there is diversity in sources that we're using to diversity in reading passages on an English assessment, for example, and diversity in who we're asking to participate in item reviews and passage reviews before content even makes it to the assessment. So there's kind of a baseline there in making sure that we're bringing multiple perspectives to the table from the outset. And then a step further than that is, okay, so we have all of these multiple perspectives. How can we make sure that we are including all of the perspectives and validating them and really taking into account the things that these disparate groups are telling us? And I think that is part of moving toward a more inclusive assessment and development process, which in theory and hope leads to more equitable assessments that are more equitably measuring student performance in a way that includes not only the inclusion is not only in the development process, but then also in what students are seeing and seeing themselves reflected in the assessments. And I feel like in that way, we're moving more toward equitable outcomes in what we're seeing in assessment. So I think they are very distinct: diversity, inclusion, and equity, and some I feel are precursors to others, but still lots of thinking and questioning and work to unpack to really achieve on all three of those aspects.
Makes sense. I'm going to stick with you for a minute, Stephanie, if you don't mind. And it's almost another definition question, but a couple of things you've said have given me pause. I'm trying to think through it because I really like what you say that you want the students to feel that their experience is worthy of inclusion, is what you said. Really resonated with me. But you went on to say, but there's no single story, which I took to mean there's no, this is what a Black person does. This is what a Hispanic person does. This was a Native American person does. There's no one story. But to me, that brings me to the question number 2 about how do I set something up so that students feel seen and feel included and feel validated, but don't feel pigeonholed? Like, how are you finding that balance? Because that seems to me like it would be a bit of a tricky balance.
Like I said, more questions than answers here, Andy.
Yes.
For sure. It's a very excellent question. And it's something that we're putting out there into the world to speak the things, to say the words, to have the ideas out there, but welcome collaboration and other folks' opinions on how we can make those aspirations more of a reality. I think that statewide assessment especially is pretty hard because there's a real estate issue, right? You can only put so many questions, so many passages into an assessment. And so thinking about how statewide assessments can drive changes at the district level or at the classroom level and work with educators and administrators to see how they are bringing culturally responsive and anti-racist ideas into their curriculum and their daily instruction could be a way to start. I'm throwing that out there as that's a possible way to go. There may be other ideas that are better that I have not thought of, but I think that it is something that does need to be tackled system-wide. It can certainly start from a state level, but requires a partnership of all stakeholders of our community and educators and administrators within districts.
Kristen or Fiona, Deb, you have something to add.
Oh, I was just going to piggyback on what Stephanie said, and I think it's about trying to find the balance and the purpose about where is what you're trying to do best suited. And I think really elevating what's happening in the classroom and the connection with students there and honoring their culture and their experiences within the classroom.
Any thoughts, Kristen or Fiona?
I agree with Deb, and I also think that it's complex, and at the same time, we do have an opportunity to connect to our communities and to take the time to understand and to take the time to listen and to learn. And I think that's an area that we could definitely emphasize more, is understanding the communities that we serve, understanding the students that we serve and the communities that they're from, to help support providing that context that is real, that is reflective of their experiences and not sort of isolated. And at the same time, certainly not one experience reflects the entire community. And there are ways, I think, of being able to capture communities and support reflecting context, so that there is that opportunity for kids to be empowered, for students to be empowered because they see themselves.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Kristen? I want to give you a chance.
No, I really don't have anything to add. I just wanted to amplify, the bringing it back to, and Deb and Fiona both just did this really well, bringing it back to the classroom and assessments are a mean to an end. And if we can support how students are engaging and feeling and living in the classroom, I think that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I really like that. I'm going to start with you next, Fiona, with question number 3 only. I'm going to add a twist to it, because in the chat, there was a mention about this happening in a state like Texas, where we have, we're clearly representing here, talking about Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and Washington State are all more of our liberal states, but those are not all of our states. And I really liked your drawing your image of how we start with just an awareness, moving all the way up to where we could be with social justice. That image really helped me think this through. But what are the implications of moving from context void to context rich? And is it something, if we stick with what you guys just talked about bringing it back to the classroom, is it something we can do anywhere, regardless of the politics going on? Or is this something we really can only do where the politics are supportive? Fiona?
Great question. I think that once again, that we know that each community and each school community, district and state is different. And that where we are in each state as it relates to equity, as it relates to supporting students and keeping students at the focus of our assessment of our curriculum and instruction, that it's different and that it varies. And I think we have to begin with where they are. And start there. What are the discussions that are happening? And I also think that hearing once again from students and understanding that there really isn't anything, I disagree that there's any such thing as context void. There's context in everything. And even if and when we have tried to eliminate context, even if it's a math equation, there is context. And I think that is a misunderstanding that we can actually provide anything that is context void. And so I think we have to know the communities that we are serving, and we have to understand and take the time to understand where the conversation is when it comes to equitable practices and doing what's best for students. I think a lot of times these conversations get polarized because of politics. And then we move away from understanding and supporting students based on who they are. And I think that is context in itself. Who are the students and who are the communities that we serve? And there is diversity and equity issues and inclusion opportunities in every community across our country. And so I think that that some of the implications are certainly around how we consider and what we define as good literature, for example, and the literature that we are selecting and the criteria that we use in order to identify that selection. I think that this, context rich includes our processes as we review items for those communities and with those communities, and that we set criteria that is supportive of who the students are that are going to engage with this assessment and who are going to engage with this content. And I think that the implications of politics and polarization versus creating frameworks that acknowledge and empower and value the students, I'm not sure that we will end up in a place where we can't address equity if we are concerned with the identities and the experiences and the cultures of the students that we're serving. And I think that some of these implications will mean that we have to change what we do in order to support the communities that we serve, because we can create frameworks that identify and support engaging with students and understanding their identities, no matter who they are. And so I think that the implications change how the lens that we use to approach our work, and starting with students, starting with who they are and how they identify themselves as a way to support building context-rich assessment.
And I was going to ask you to reflect on that as well, because I know even within Washington State, there's some places over in the East that have different politics than, say, Seattle. Do you have to work with this within your own state, within your own communities, and how big of a struggle is that?
Yes, there are certainly different politics and perceptions around it, and I am thinking I haven't honestly, with respect to assessment specifically. Certainly, it's something that we think about with respect to other policies and whatnot, and how to communicate it, and depends on leadership. So I don't know that I really have a great answer for that.
That's okay. These are not easy questions. And Kristen, I'm curious from your perspective, because Curriculum Associates works with so many states across the entire country. How do you balance that idea? Because your ideals are so strong and your values are so strong, but they're not going to be reflected in all your constituents. So how do you address that?
Well, it's been very challenging. And so, what we're hoping is that this validity evidence that we are collecting over the coming years will help us make the case that these types of items in the assessment lifts all students. And that's my belief in my heart. Now I need the research and the evidence to show that. And it's going to take time. But yeah, it's been really it's been very challenging to figure out how to navigate this when we have an assessment program that is national. One thing that helps us is that our assessment is designed specifically to inform instruction. So we follow the guidelines that are in our instructional materials. And so that is our true north. So that helps. But what also helps me is that I can remember that this work is a means to an end. And if I think more holistically about all of the things we're doing to help teachers make equitable decisions in the classroom with the assessment data and all of the other instructional tools that they have at their disposal, that's where I personally gather my inspiration and hope. Assessment is a means to an end.
Nice. Stephanie, with question number 4, you've already addressed some of this and talking about you were looking at how to change some of the bias and sensitivity committees and what review committees look at. But I want to just follow up on what Kristen said and ask you, when you think about what do we do short term versus what do you do long term, how do you think about it in terms of the assessment program versus instruction and curriculum and what you're trying to actually have kids learn within the District of Columbia?
There's a lot wrapped up in those questions. And my personal experience in our team's work is most closely connected to statewide assessment. We have other really great teams within OSSE that focus on other aspects of education broadly. And certainly we have partnerships internally with those other divisions, but continuing conversations need to happen to make sure that we are taking a more holistic, wide-ranging approach. I think that from our perspective and from my presentation perspective, we're looking at what we can do in assessment specifically, given the content standards that we do have. What can we do to make sure that our assessments are doing the best that they can by our students within those constraints and that framework of our standards. I think in terms of short-term measures that are easier, I kind of balk at the word easier because none of this is easy, but there are certainly things that can be implemented more quickly that the hope is that they would eventually lead to greater results in the long term. So I think that partnership is probably what I would say is the number one answer. Having folks talk to each other, having folks talk to stakeholders and really understand what our priorities are and what area of leverage or influence each of us has in making improvements to the whole system.
That makes sense. Fiona, I wanted to follow up on one of your slides because it really struck me. And it was an example you gave, and I didn't get the title quite right, but it was something like climate change is racism or something like that. And it struck me because I thought, wow, that headline or that title of that passage in and of itself would make headlines in some states. That would be like, this is what our tests are doing, they're brainwashing students. So how do you balance that of pushing this framework and saying, this is how we're being responsive? And you talked about cultural responsiveness to cultural sustainability, to social justice. Was that pushing the envelope and that we're not ready for that? Or is that starting gates for some places? How are you balancing that I don't know, conundrum?
Well, you know, Marianne, this experience working with Boston Public Schools, I would say that they, especially the teachers, have pushed us. I think that their motivation and passion for framing social justice for their students pushed the process as well as the identification of passages around climate change. That was climate change is racial injustice, and so I would say that this experience has also pushed my thinking around the possibilities of supporting social justice within the context of assessment. And I think that it's important to know that Boston Public Schools has been working on this for a long time. They have made this a priority. And so engaging with them on this particular project has been really supporting their lead. And I think that that's a really important part of this process. I think that, you know, as an organization, we need to be able to state our claim around how we are addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that that's important, that we take a stance. And I also think that we're supporting educational communities to meet their goals. And when we have a district like Boston Public Schools who is ready to frame social justice as a part of their ongoing embedded work with curriculum assessment and instruction, that we're able to support them with that. And it truly was a situation where we brought them Greta Thunberg, and they were like, that's great, our students know her and that's great, but what about kids of color and what they're doing? We want the opportunity for there to be a reflection of our students that has been absent in our assessments. And so I think that their leadership and charge with knowing who their students are and being passionate about equity and social justice and anti-racism within the context of their community really pushed us to be able to provide that. And to be able to identify those particular passages. We're in the midst of this, so we're certainly under the review process. However, and we've gone back and forth with the teachers, and they've challenged us to be even more intentional about framing social justice with climate change. And I think that's an important part of the process, is that we're able to support meeting those expectations and goals. And when schools and districts and states aren't there, that we start with where they are and support them with moving forward.
I really like that. I was just thinking, if I had two takeaways from here, it's just, I'm hearing one, involve the local communities. And as you just said, find out where they are and how far they're willing to go, and bring that into your assessments, bring that into the assessment development. And then secondly, do that research. We need to have the research that really validates a lot of what we're saying, that the cultural familiarity will result in a more authentic assessment of a student's knowledge and skills. So if those are two big takeaways, I'd like to conclude with one question for everybody. And I actually am going to ask Ellen to go last. So we'll get from all five of you is, what would be a goal for either you and your company or for NCME and then the measurement field in general? What is a goal that we should be aspiring to over the next year, over the next 12 months? Kristen, I'll start with you.
Well, I'll start micro, and then macro. Our goal at CA is to collect more data directly from students. In partnership for the Center for Measurement Justice, Dr. Randall, we are really committed to evolving our hypotheses and evolving our research questions through these direct interactions with students around these prototypes. So that's job one this year. From a macro level as a field, I think we need to continue to have these dialogues, continue to recognize that there is not a single perspective in our field that we can gel around yet. And we need to really start thinking about what this means for our collective research agenda as a field. And also what this means for the next version of the standards. So we've got to start having a lot of dialogue, and I encourage you to look for places where that dialogue is happening and join in.
We all have the standards right next to our keyboards. Deb, I'll go to you next.
I don't have it next to my keyboard, but it's over there. I think about awareness when you put the time qualifier of in the next year, it's like, okay, that's going to change my answer. I think about awareness and self-awareness and rethinking everything. Like, because as we learn and become aware of ourselves and where we are and what we've done, asking those questions, just like the ones about the climate change and the racism within that. And so rethinking all of the things, whether they're little or big, I think is critical for all of us at every step. I think it's just asking that question every step of the way.
Nice. Stephanie?
I have to go back to my next step slide. But in all seriousness, I think that at OSSE as an organization, one of our big goals for the next year is really that gets actually to question number 6 on your slide here, defining what we mean when we say culturally responsive, when we say anti-racist, putting it on paper. These are the words that we mean when we say culturally responsive. These are the actions we want to see. These are the outcomes we are hoping to achieve. So that internal work of bringing more clarity to the conversations that we have with our vendors and with stakeholders within the community to understand, to make sure that we're all kind of rowing the boat in the same direction. So as an internal organization, DC level, I think that that's one of our goals for the next year. And I think, to echo Kristen's point, as a field, to continue having the conversations, bringing in additional perspectives, and just keep the conversation going.
Nice. Fiona?
I think that it's really important that we leverage the current research that has been done and that we start trying things. I think that we understand why and why we need to address diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what needs to be addressed based on our history and based on what has been missing in terms of context for DEI. And I would urge us to take from the research that has been done and begin to try things out and document it so that we have evidence and so that we are creating practices, because I think that, context void to context rich changes everything. And so we've got to take pieces of our practice and transform it and try things out so that we can make the changes that are needed.
Thank you. Ellen, can you bring us home?
Well, I think I don't have really much to add to the fantastic voices. I think we've heard today too about amplifying the voices of students and educators, inspiring one another to really reflect and to learn. I think we have to get to that important point of killing our darlings, which is standardization of everything. That has to go. So we have to understand why we do it. And we're all why people. So we have to get serious about applying why to everything we do, because a lot of what we do has just been tradition and it heads in the wrong direction. So I'm definitely inspired from the panelists today, and thank you very much for your deep thinking and experiences that you've shared today. I look forward to continuing these conversations within our community and in the networks among communities who care about kids in this country.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.